Good evening, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As you know, it's just after 8:30 live here in the UK. We're coming to you from the studios of British Muslim TV in Wakefield, West Yorkshire, with this week's live edition of Questions with me, Mohammed Shafiq. We're broadcasting Sky Channel 752 and across social media at British Muslim TV. Wherever you are joining us, a very warm welcome. Now, we want you to comment on the big stories we're covering tonight. Call us now on 01924 231 083 or messages on the WhatsApp number which is on the screen now. And if you're watching this on Facebook, post your comments in the chat box and we'll read some of them on air later. Tonight, first we head to talk to Moazzam Begg on his life fighting for human rights and his personal struggles. Then we head to Birmingham to talk to Razwan Faraz, the former deputy head teacher, caught up in the Trojan Horse scandal and that New York Times podcast. We finish off in London and talk to Dr Salman Butt about taking a stance for Muslims. So we want to hear from you tonight. You can call us now on 01924 231 083 or messages on British Muslim TV across social media. Alternatively, you heard it right, you can send us a WhatsApp message. The number is on the screen now. The questions we're considering tonight: human rights around the world. Why is this so important in the 21st century? Trojan Horse caused so much concern in Birmingham schools. Were you affected? And if so, what impact did that scandal have on you and your children's education? Love to hear your stories about that. And then your final question: why is it important to take a stance from British Muslims here in the UK and around the world? As I said, share your thoughts now on 01924 231 083 or messages on WhatsApp, post on social media. We'll read some of your comments throughout the programme. As I said, we're live and lines are open, so please do call. Let's get started on the first story. Moazzam Begg was born and grew up in Sparkhill in Birmingham. He's had an extraordinary life, held in Guantanamo Bay for 3 years after being arrested in Pakistan, tortured and abused, but released in 2005, and since has spent his life fighting for human rights, speaking up against the so-called war on terror. He's written books and newspaper columns, and he's a speaker featured around the world. He's currently an outreach director for the charitable organisation and advocacy group Cage. Pleased to say Moazzam Begg is live on British Muslim TV from London. Moazzam Begg, a very warm welcome to the programme. Thank you so much for honouring us with your presence.
Assalamu alaikum, Mohammed Shafiq. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I hope we have a really good discussion.
Good. Well, firstly, let's start at the time you were released from Guantanamo Bay. Did you ever, in those 3 years, think that you would be released?
No, of course, this was the tactics of the United States. It was to make me believe and make all the prisoners believe that despite the fact that we're held without charge or trial, we will not be going home. It's one of the tactics they use to try to kind of break us, as it were. But of course, slowly but surely, I did start seeing prisoners being released. And eventually, when I did get access to a lawyer, which was, I didn't have any charges, but a lawyer was allowed to come after 3 years, he told me that you will be going home because the amount of the stories of the torture that's come out has been too hard now for the British government to try to argue that there's some kind of a natural justice legal system here. And eventually that's what led to my release.
Tell us about how you choose your current path in life of being an advocate for human rights, because most people wouldn't deny you the right to rebuild your life away from the spotlight, yet you didn't choose that. You choose the spotlight.
Yeah, well, one of the things I think was my father, may Allah have mercy on him. He was a very strong, ardent campaigner for me and for other prisoners. He laid the path down for me to follow. And my feeling was that he was somebody that, wasn't used to this, yet he took up the mantle and he did it for myself. And its effects were on many other prisoners, not just me. So that was the first thing. The second thing is my Islamic code of justice, my belief in the concept of justice, even towards your enemy. It's a statement in the Quran, tells Muslims not to allow your animosity of a people to cause you to do them an injustice. All of this, of course, and the wider war on terror and the fact that there were still so many people in Guantanamo being tortured for decades on end without charge or trial. I had a duty upon me, I think, to carry this task. And I did so with the support of my organization, Cage.
And then how do you assess the war on terror? We're in 2022, 21 years since that war on terror started. How do you assess it?
I think the best way to assess it right now is with Ukraine. There is no better way, because everything that we've seen targeting Muslims who went out to say they wanted to support an insurgency or support against an occupation, the Palestinians, all of these things now have kind of come into 1 week. In 1 week of the occupation by the Russians of Ukraine, we've seen the entirety of the war on terror and the legislation that follow fall flat on its head. Britain now will be forced to say that we support, once Russia takes over Kiev, they will have to support the insurgency. And in doing so, they will have to change the entirety of their language towards Muslims that have been for the past 20 years to say any Muslims involved in fighting an occupation or speaking out against an occupation or resisting an occupation are by definition terrorists. What are you going to do now in Ukraine when that very thing is going to happen, and the Russians will say anybody who fights against us is a terrorist? So now the very leaders who supported the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan are speaking out against occupation and invasion, and it's absolutely bizarre to watch this happen.
Now, you've been very clear over the years, but I've known you and everybody, the world knows about your struggles, that you oppose and condemn terrorism. So why is it that there are still your opponents who still try to label you as a terrorist sympathizer or a pseudo-extremist?
Well, one of the things is that, as I said, the language of terrorism is going to change. Remember, Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. He was convicted as a terrorist and believed in the right to fight against occupation. And yet today we have statues of him outside Parliament. So what does it mean that the idea of somebody being a terrorist, it makes it one day you're a terrorist, one day you're a freedom fighter. It really doesn't make sense. And to label people with these lazy, I have called this lazy statements, really means nothing at all. If we say the targeting of innocent people, non-combatants, the use of violence against ordinary people who are living in their homes, if that's something that's terrorism, then we all condemn it. But if you are talking about, and I say it again, that in Ukraine, people are being taught to use Molotov cocktails. Boris Johnson is supporting that. Liz Truss recently said that I support people from Britain joining up to fight as irregulars against the Russians. Now, what does that mean? Are they terrorists? Because I haven't done that. I haven't made Molotov cocktails and thrown them against an occupier. But would I be a terrorist if I did do that? So these are really important questions that are being asked now. And because people did it against British and American occupation forces, did that make them actually terrorists, or were they fighting against an occupation? These are really fundamental questions that I think our politicians are going to be very in a really difficult place to be able to answer them now that Ukraine is happening.
Yeah, and there's a significant change in the rhetoric towards this particular crisis. But I just wanted to take you back to, say, Syria, what happened in Libya, and in other hotspots around the world where the language was somewhat different and asylum seekers and refugees were treated completely different to the way they've been treated now.
So look what happened. I mean, during the revolution in Syria, I went to Syria in 2012, 2013, and I went initially to go and investigate because I had been threatened by the British and the Americans that if I didn't cooperate in Iran, where I was held and tortured, that I'd be sent to Syria or to Egypt, which was really shocking. So when the revolution happened, I wanted to go and meet rendition victims and highlight their cases and bring it back and bring some legal challenges in the UK and the US against those who'd been involved in their rendition. When I was there for a short period of time, I met some rebels. And these rebels, it's important, they were fighting the Assad regime, but also the Russians were involved in bombing them. And so I assisted some of them. I gave some of them a little bit of fitness training. And when I came back, I was arrested and prosecuted for terrorism. That's why they tried to prosecute me, because I showed them how to do press-ups and sit-ups. And these are the same people that were being supported by the British government, at least through non-lethal aid and verbally in Parliament. And of course, when ISIS came along, this was well before ISIS, 2 years before ISIS came, the rhetoric changed from supporting the Syrian revolution to opposing it and actually saying that anybody that's involved in helping the revolution is a terrorist. And that's what started to happen. But it became even more bizarre because in Libya, where the same thing was happening, you had the RAF flying bombing sorties, hitting Gaddafi, while on the ground were Libyan Islamic fighting group Mujahideen who were fighting. So air cover for the Mujahideen in Libya was given by the RAF. And then some of these went on to go and fight in Syria, and then they were prosecuted for terrorism. So it's a complete mess and muddle. And I think we're going to find a lot more of this happening. But to to throw these lazy things against people and say they're terrorists, if that's terrorism, then what do you call the fight for liberation? It doesn't make sense.
And how important is the work that you do in Cage to highlight some of these injustices that you described?
So yeah, I mean, this has of course reached us as now these are all far off issues, but if we talk about in Britain, how has this affected us in Britain? We've had almost every year a new counter-terror law applied, almost in application, almost exclusively to Muslims. We have concluded that Islamophobia isn't just something on the streets with the EDL or Tommy Robinson. That's easily dealt with. This is at state level. And why do I say this? I'll give you one example. Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000 allows police officers to detain a person for up to 6 hours. Before that, it was 9 hours, without charge, without trial, without any reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed. And they can search you, they can strip search you, they can take your DNA, your fingerprints, your photographs, and the passwords to every one of your devices, even though you're not even suspected of committing a crime. A report by Cambridge University in 2016 found that at just one airport in the country, 88% of the people stopped under this law were Muslims. Now, we are 4% of the entire population. So that tells you the level of which Islamophobia is across the board at state level. Then if you look at the PREVENT program, which disproportionately targets children at schools because of the normative Islamic beliefs, then you can see how this is pervaded into society. And this is all because of the war on terrorism.
Okay. Moazzam, stay there. I know you're going to stay with us. We're going to take a very quick break. When we come back, we'll continue the important conversation we're having with our exclusive conversation with Moazzam Begg about the war on terror, his lived experience, and the challenges that he somewhat has been facing. You're watching Questions with me, Mohammed Shafiq, exclusively here on British Muslim TV. We'll take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll continue the conversation. Join us on the other side of these very important messages. Don't go anywhere. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Questions with me, Mohammed Shafiq, exclusively here on British Muslim TV, live from our studios here in sunny Wakefield. And then you'll tell me it's not sunny, it's dark like it is across the UK because it's the evening. Keep up. We're taking your calls on 0192, put my teeth back in, 01924 231083. Get in touch with us on social media, British Muslim TV. We're having an exclusive conversation with Moazzam Begg. My special guest is joining us live from London. Before the break, Moazzam, we were talking about the war on terror. Now, 21 years on, Guantanamo Bay is still open. President Biden, like President Obama, has said he wants to see it closed. Do you think it will ever close?
That's a very important question. How do you close a United States city, a town? How do you close down a town? And the answer is really in the intentions of all of the US presidents. Guantanamo has become a very visible symbol of America. I'd say it's as American as apple pie. So you've got Obama, who said he'd close it down. You had before him Bush, who opened the place and he said he'd want to close it down. And you had Trump, who said he'll keep the place open. Biden has released one prisoner since he came into power, and that's been over 1 year. And it's a bipartisan project. Guantanamo is. It's something that both Democrats and Republicans have oversawn. And until somebody actually says that this place brings us into terrible disrepute, that it has not caused the prosecution of a single prisoner for the reason why Guantanamo was open in the first place, and that is to prosecute those who were involved in 9/11. Not one person has been successfully prosecuted for involvement in 9/11. So will he close it? I think, the sad part is most of the American public don't really care. I'm more concerned with the prisoners. I want to see them released. They can keep it open and have it as a museum. But I'm hoping that the prisoners will slowly but surely start to get cleared for release, as at least half of them are, half of the 39 are. And then the rest slowly, hopefully, will find homes in parts of the world where they can be relocated.
What's the legacy, do you think, of Guantanamo Bay?
Torture, detention without trial, the absence of the rule of law, the loss of the presumption of innocence, the removal of the Geneva Conventions, orange jumpsuits where people are taken in Iraq and other places and dressed in orange jumpsuits by kidnappers and then abused and executed. The concept of waterboarding, a medieval torture technique that was used against Muslims and Jews in Spain by the Spanish conquistadors, by the Spanish inquisitors. All of these things, the very image that the United States wants to show of itself is the very image that Guantanamo dispels.
I just wanted to take a couple of calls as well, because we've got quite a few calls written and lots of comments on social media. We'll try to include your comments as well. But let's go to line 1. I think we've got a sister on line 1. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. I just want to add one point in your discussion that
Sure.
There is big explosion on media about, I know it's not relating to specifically about that prison you're mentioning, but it's like big explosion on media about human crisis. Every single thing they mention about Ukraine, every single thing they show on media. But when it comes to Muslim countries like Syria, like Afghanistan, Iraq, everywhere else, we didn't see how much people were suffering, what was happening to the people. And when Taliban, they took over, they were showing these really, like, you can't even see those scenes about the American prison.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, sister. Yeah, you've added your viewpoint. Let's move on very quickly because our time is of the essence, Moazzam. I just wanted to ask you about you taking legal action to restore your British passport, which has been taken away from you. Where are we in terms of that legal action, and are you hopeful that you'll get your passport back?
Okay, yeah. So as I said, they took my passport away back in 2013, which was ridiculous. That was, I just come back from a trip to South Africa when Mandela had died, and I was actually speaking in some of the prisons where he'd been held. But my passport was taken because it was deemed that I was involved in terrorist activity for giving that physical training that I told you in Syria. Since that time now, I've had a passport issued, and then it's been revoked again by Priti Patel's government, saying it was issued in error. So we've taken the government to court. We issued a judicial review. I believe that they will really, before this gets to court, they'll probably capitulate, because it's going to make them look really bad. How can you say, when I was released from prison, the police actually said, and I quote the words, "Moazzam Begg is an innocent man." And so the prosecution failed even before it got to kind of, to Crown Court. So where we are at with that is it's judicial review. It's in the High Court, and we are taking them to court. Alhamdulillah, we've done a huge crowdfunding campaign, and we got £10,000 support within 1 week. So I'm very confident, inshallah, and I'm very thankful to the community for that support.
Because you may have been cleared of any wrongdoing over the years, from the wrongful arrest by the CIA in Pakistan, to the treatment that you had at Guantanamo Bay, to the allegations that were made, false allegations that were made of terrorism in 2012-13. But that suspicion and treatment that you often are still describing happens in a different format. How do you cope with that?
Well, I thank Allah for giving me the ability to have a community around me, to have an organization around me, and to have the will. For me, that's really important. I've met, as you know, with world leaders, with community leaders, with movers and shakers around the world, and they've listened to me. I've met with former Guantanamo soldiers, guards, interrogators. Just a couple of weeks, I'll be talking alongside some brigadier generals of the United States military, all of whom speak out against Guantanamo, all of whom support our view. It's not the other way around. So as long as there's good people around, then I'm more than happy to take this fight. This is what I've chosen. It's what it's my conviction in life now. This is what I am. This is what I do. So, and if I don't do it, there's not many people with my kind of experience or understanding that can. So I'm kind of I'm almost it's a duty for me, and I'm happy to carry that duty out.
Yeah, let's take a couple of more calls. Let's go to line 2 and brother's on the line. Assalamu alaikum. Yes, brother.
Assalamu alaikum, brother. I have a question for Moazzam. I think Saifullah Paracha was released by the Americans. Well, they announced that he's free to go, but how come Pakistan is not accepting him back, as well as the Rabbani brothers?
All right, so this is a really important question. Saifullah Paracha is a very well-known Pakistani citizen. He's one of 4 Pakistani citizens still in Guantanamo. He has been cleared for release. Now, being cleared for release in Guantanamo doesn't mean you're going to be freed. There are people in Guantanamo, including a couple of Pakistanis, who've been cleared for almost a decade, but they haven't been sent back. This isn't Pakistan's fault. I will say this much. Pakistan's fault was in sending people there in the first place. I was handed over by Pakistan. This was at the time of Pervez Musharraf, who was in charge of the country, who was selling people without any legal process. But in the process of people coming back from Pakistan, Pakistan has welcomed back a number of prisoners, and I don't think the problem is from Pakistan. It's from the United States of America. Imran Khan himself, I've met him a couple of times and spoken to him about the case of Afia Siddiqui in the past. Unfortunately, it's not been one of the main cases that he's taken up, though he was very interested before. But nonetheless, Saifullah Paracha is a very well-known businessman. In fact, in Guantanamo, he's known as the father of the prisoners. He gives prisoners all sorts of abilities to run their daily life, to teach them, to educate them. He's, as I said, a very successful businessman who's thrown into Guantanamo without charge or trial, and he's the oldest prisoner in Guantanamo.
Okay.
Moazzam,
we've run out of time. Sorry, my brother, we've run out of time. We've got one more question. I think we can get to you, Moazzam. Sorry about the caller that we had to cut you there, but we're talking about Trojan Horse later with our other guest. Have you listened to the New York Times podcast? What's your reaction to it?
Yes, I have heard the podcast. I am from the city of Birmingham myself.
You are, yeah.
I know this. I know
you can't get any more Birmingham than you from Spark Hill, can you?
No, you can't. You can't get any more than that. So yeah, I know all of the players in it very well, and people who I saw them turn these schools, the Parkview School in particular, from a failing school into an outstanding school. I've seen people turn away from the school, trying to get their kids out of those schools, and then after they turned it outstanding into, it was oversubscribed, and I was one of those people who's trying to get my child into that school. So I know how hard Tahir Alam and these guys worked, and I know the level of which they used counter-terrorism. It's important that it's not counter-extremism or counter-radicalization, counter-terrorism officers to investigate what happened in these schools. And what happened in these schools, in one word, was just envy. They did not want to see Muslim schools doing well as they did, and as a result of that, they tried to bring down the entire system and ruin the lives of all these teachers and governors in the process.
And then final question, sir. What does the future hold for you?
The future, well, it's not orange. If you remember that there used to be this... The future's not orange, though, inshallah, I believe it's bright. I believe it's bright. I say that with a smile on my face. I always keep hopeful. No matter how great the difficulties, there is always ease. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Inna ma'al usri yusra, that with difficulty comes ease. And whilst there's difficulty constantly around us all the time, we went through COVID, I've gone through my own personal difficulties, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. So my view is to get Muslims to become more confident, to become more articulate, to become more able, to become more part of society, and to become more emboldened to be able to say the truth even at the hardest of times.
And I'd be really cheeky and ask you one more question, a very short answer. What's your message to our viewers watching this?
The message is be hopeful. Be hopeful, stand up, smile in the face of atrocities.
Well, you've been an absolute star. Thank you so much for all that you're doing. Keep safe, my friend, and love to the family.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Moazzam Begg there joining us live from London. Thank you so much for the time that you've given us tonight here on British Muslim TV. As I said, there was lots of questions coming through, lots of calls waiting as well, so we weren't able to get through them. My apologies for that. He was an author, he's a campaigner, he's an outreach director for Cage, joining us there from London. Now, after the break, we're going to head to Birmingham for an exclusive conversation with the former deputy head of a primary school caught up in a Trojan Horse scandal and that New York Times podcast that I keep talking about. Join us on the other side of these very important messages. You don't want to go anywhere, because if you remember what happened in Birmingham and to those schools, as Moazzam was talking about, people lived this, and lots of people can join us and ask questions. 01924 231 083. Join us on the other side of these messages. Welcome back to Questions with me, Mohammed Shafiq, exclusively here on British Muslim TV, live from our studios here in Wakefield. Now, we're taking calls on 01924 231 083. Get in touch with us on our social media handle, British Muslim TV. Now, let's move on to our next topic and our guest. In November 2013, Birmingham City Council received an anonymous photocopy of a letter saying Muslims in the city schools were conspiring to take over the running of schools. The council passed the letter to the Department of Education, who ordered an independent investigation. You all know how the story developed, but the most important thing to remember that wasn't factored in was the impact on the pupils. Now, Razwan Faraz was the deputy head teacher at a Birmingham school during the Trojan Horse scandal. He was caught up when homophobic comments in a WhatsApp group were leaked to the media. Razwan Faraz was cleared of professional misconduct by an independent panel in 2017. But he feels he was never really exonerated in the public court and still lives through the trauma and impact on himself and his wider family. The matter was recently covered by the New York Times in their Trojan Horse podcast series, which is once again shining a light on the story. Pleased to say Razwan Faraz is joining us for an exclusive conversation here on British Muslim TV from Birmingham. Razwan, assalamu alaikum, and very warm welcome to the program. Great to have you on.
Wa alaikum salam, Shafiq. Thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, I know you lost your father in recent times. Tell us about him, tell our viewers about him, and what was it like growing up in inner city Birmingham?
Well, my father came into this country, when he was a young child. He worked very, very hard. And, I had a huge amount of love for him. Unfortunately, last year, he caught COVID. And on the back of that, he went into a coma and he passed away. He was an individual that gave everything to his family. There were significant changes in our relationship, which happened because of the way he had to work many, many hours. And, over the years, we didn't see him as much. But over the last 10 years, I myself began to build a much more closer relationship with him. So losing him in the way that we did, not being able to visit him in hospital, not being able to, see him in his last moments was, incredibly difficult. And I pray, inshallah, that, he is in the highest gardens of Jannah.
Inshallah. He died in a pandemic, and you're absolutely right. And we send our love to you and your mum as well, and the rest of the family.
Ameen.
So much love to you. So let's get on. Tell us firstly about what interested you in becoming a teacher.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I myself was working in an education charity. After I'd graduated from university, I was working in Vodafone, and I was, trying to find some meaning in life. I remember the managers at Vodafone asked me to come onto their leadership program. And it was at that moment that I realized that the work that I'm doing is really helping someone else make money as opposed to something meaningful in life. So I applied for a role with an education charity promoting the teaching profession amongst, ethnic minority communities, the Muslim community in particular. And as a result of just inviting others to consider giving value to education and teaching, I myself almost convinced myself to come into teaching. And thereafter, I just fell in love with helping young people to see themselves as a part and parcel of this society. I know that I myself grew up in a working class community and found myself very much lost a lot of the time in life. And so being that teacher, that role model for these young kids was something that I had a deep commitment to. And being around other teachers when I worked at Parkview, at Nansen and other places, being around these other teachers was something that also inspired me to want to do my very best.
And then what was it like when you became that teacher? Because for most people who, well, obviously people who go to Birmingham would know that inner city Birmingham, Spark Hill, Sparkbrook, Small Heath, generally speaking, lots of the teachers would have been white, like when we were growing up as well. So you get, you become that teacher, you start to make a difference in the classroom. What changes do you see in the pupils?
It's a really good question. I remember the very first day I became a deputy head teacher. It's a time that I share with a lot of people whenever they ask me to recall, some of the most important moments when I was a teacher. So I'm a deputy, and I, as was very typical of me when I was in leadership, I would go to the front gate and welcome the children into the school. So on my first day, the children don't know me; they've never seen me before. A young boy, he's 10, maybe 11, comes up to me and he says, and he points to me and he says, "Who are you?" And I turn to him and I say, "I'm your new deputy." He then says to me, "No, you're not, because you're not white." And I look at him, I smile and I say, "I am. And guess what? One day you can be too." And he says, "Really?" And I say, "Yeah." And he then turns around, smiles, and just, skips and walks away. And, therein, in that moment, what this young boy saw was the possibility of a new reality for himself, because up until that time, for him, the experience that he had had made him think, as young as 10 or 11 years old, that leadership in schools is not a something that he has aspirations towards, that leadership is in his words, a white thing.
Now,
and so being able to teach children, being able to be there for them, for myself and others, was giving them a sense of aspiration, that they can, that they have a greater hope than what sometimes society expects from them.
So what was your reaction when that letter, the anonymous Trojan Horse letter, was leaked to the media by someone, and your school and the schools around your community, and you began to be targeted, as you say?
Yeah, I mean, the first time that I came across the letter in an article, and thereafter searched for the letter online and found the letter, I ridiculed it as something that would very quickly be dismissed as a falsehood. I immediately, because I at the time worked in Birmingham schools, I knew that there were some factual errors within the letter itself. Just the way that it presented the information in there just didn't read as something real to anybody that wanted to make sense of it. And so the letter, for those who may not have seen, essentially just alleges that there's a plot to Islamify these schools. I mean, these schools are majority Muslim schools, and the suggestion is that there's some sort of takeover of these schools, which what's very interesting is that eventually the allegations against myself and other teachers was just simply that we were pressurizing the schools to meet the needs of Muslim children through an undue religious influence. And so when that was, when it was requested to say, what does that undue religious influence mean? It was simply allowing children to pray if they wanted to, introducing Islamic collective worship, which was actually within the law. Every single school, every single state school has to have an act of a collective worship, which is Christian in character, and then you can apply for a removal of that determination and allow the determination to be general, or allow the determination to be specific to that school's pupil background. In this case, it was Muslim, so it was a Muslim worship that was given. When we were targeted, I mean, I felt a huge pressure on me. I was someone that always was incredibly professional in the way that I taught in schools, handled other teachers. I was also a governor for many, many years, so I understood policy. I understood the way that the operations of how schools were. I've been in leadership then, for 4 or 5 years. And so when this whole thing happened, and when the right-wing media caught onto this and suggested that this is an actual takeover of these schools, very quickly I realized how I myself would have no real power in being able to do anything about this hatred towards Muslims and Islam.
I know after the break we're going to talk a bit more about the play and the podcast, but what impact did it have on you and your family?
I mean, the impact was huge. I wasn't just teaching. This was my passion. It was an ambition. I was on track to become a head teacher and go beyond that. And, I was running workshops, conferences, at the time, helping other teachers, mentoring them to, be the best version of themselves to children. I saw the teaching profession as very much a prophetic profession, and being able to, allow these children to see themselves in the curriculum. I mean, fundamentally, as well as other teachers that I was around, our purpose was to bridge the gap between the home and the school, because I myself grew up where I didn't consider the home and the school to be in sync with each other, but at odds with each other. And that led to a real battle as to where do I actually belong. And so being able to provide a space for children to belong was something that was driving for me. And when that was taken away, it absolutely crushed me. Something that even 8 years on right now, I still suffer with. There's huge levels of self-doubt, anxiety, questioning myself with any project that I want to get into, and the passion that I had when I was in the classroom, changing the lives and futures of these children is something that I've not felt elsewhere.
And then what impact did it have on ethnic minority communities, particularly in the city of Birmingham?
I mean, that...
Because in the whole of the thing, sorry, Razwan, we forget where the most important thing with the children and the politics and the division and the claim and counterclaim kind of diverted away from the most important people.
Well, I'll give you an example of my last week in school, which will, I think, answer your question. Is in my last week in school, a young girl comes up to me, and bearing in mind the schools were surrounded by satellite vans, reporters hounding the parents, asking them for anything about the teachers, in particular myself and a few others. Not one parent, not one child mentioned anything to them negative about any of the teachers, including myself. But there was one child that came up to me afterwards and she said to me, "Sir, why is it that they," referring to the news reporters, "why do they see us as terrorists?" And within this is a very powerful insight into what was being experienced by these pupils. This is just one pupil. And I'm pretty certain there will be many, many others who are the same, because this level of scrutiny that came upon our community at that time, simply by virtue of us being from the Muslim faith, was something that I think has damaged and left a legacy of turbulence that still we experience till this day.
I know, Razwan, you're staying with us. We're going to continue talking about that podcast and the aftermath of it and what life is like for you now. We'll also open the lines, take more of your calls on 01924 231 083. Join us on the other side of these very important messages. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Questions with me, Mohammed Shafiq, exclusive here on British Muslim TV from our studios in Wakefield. Now, we're taking your calls on 01924 231 083. You can get in touch with us on social media. The handle is British Muslim TV. Razwan Faraz is still my special guest, joining us live from Birmingham. Now, Faraz, let's just talk about those homophobic comments. The only thing that is pinned towards you from a leaked WhatsApp group. Looking back at your comments, do you now see the offensive nature of those comments?
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, unequivocally, those comments were offensive. I regret saying them. I hurt a lot of people because of them, and I wish I hadn't said them. What was very interesting is that my understanding of bigotry of racism, misogyny, homophobia was beginning to be unpacked a few years prior. These messages, they actually were, a couple of years before the Trojan Horse scandal. So they weren't actually during that time. It's very important to make that distinction. And after that time, or at least, in the years running up to the Trojan Horse scandal, I myself began to explore what actually is homophobia. Because when you're on a journey of trying to understand justice, you look at the injustice against many communities, and the LGBTQ community have had a lot of injustice towards them, as have the Black community, as have women, as have Muslims, as have other marginalized communities. And so it was really embarrassing for me to discover that these messages, which it's very difficult to explain the context of them, when you talk with a group of people in a particular context. But nevertheless, for the purpose of your viewers, it's very simple. I wish I hadn't said them because they hurt a lot of people. And I have since understood that there's an active homophobia, and I was never an active homophobe, but there certainly is, as with any bigotry, a passive bigotry. And in this case, there was a passive.
So the normalized rhetoric and normalized homophobia, which is seeped into people's conversations, is the issue that was offensive.
Yeah, in very simple terms. In Section 28 was a Tory government law, which essentially, when I was a child, in primary school, it was introduced by the government, which forced teachers to push a particular idea around, which later on has been considered deeply homophobic, that essentially was suggesting that the LGBTQ community do not have proper family relationships, and they should never be spoken of within the school, or they should be spoken in a manner that's unbefitting of that community, essentially. So that, I believe, is one of the factors, one of the major factors, being a child that was in a school that essentially was ultimately, being driven by the standards of the government at the time, the Tory government.
Yeah.
Coupled with the fact that I, grew up in a conservative background, I think there was a passive homophobia that we pick up, and we have to unpack it. We have to see actually where is it that these ideas come from.
Okay.
And I'm grateful that I was able to unpack that now.
Okay, and then you said in 2017, in response to the investigation and to the General Teaching Standards Council, that you would change. Just tell us about what's changed about you as a result of your experience. In relation to the comments? Yes.
Yeah. So the change actually occurred in early 2010. A friend of mine, a Muslim friend of mine, shared with me that he said that he is gay, and I began to explore with him, what does that mean from a point of view of just his humanity? What does that mean? I, up until that time, had never met a single Muslim who was, who'd say that they were gay. And in this case, when he shared it with me, I myself began to realize that there's a question that he is asking himself as to whether he can be Muslim and be gay. And that question in itself was deeply troubling for him, and deeply troubling for how he then navigated life. And so to accept him and to honor him as a Muslim, regardless of whatever experiences he has had in life, it was a very important realization for me, that it wasn't about something that I had no experience of myself. I'd never met somebody from the LGBTQ community. So that was one element that began to unravel my understanding of what it means to be to be from that community. But theology aside, and I'm not a theologian, and I'm not in any shape or form expressing that, but theology aside, the most important thing for me was nobody should be denied their human rights. And that's very simple. For me, the simple thing at that time was that regardless of where you are from or what anybody agrees or disagrees with you, your human rights should never be denied. And the LGBTQ communities have been denied their human rights. And along, many things have changed, but they've been denied their human rights for a very, very long time. And so that change began actually in around 2010, 2011, after the messages.
Okay, and let's just talk about that podcast, the New York Times, which is causing a huge wave, not just here in the UK, but across the world. It's getting millions of new listeners and learning about the story. What impact has that had, and what involvement have you had with the podcast?
Well, the podcast, the reporters, Brian Reed and Hamza Saeed, approached us at the inception of their investigation. And what was quite distinct between these two journalists and every other journalist prior to that was that they had a more investigative approach to how they wanted to address the whole thing. And more importantly, the question of who wrote the letter was quite prominent in the inquiry, because up until that time, it was every journalist was just simply reporting a particular narrative that they were being fed, that this is just a bunch of troubling Muslim men who are causing issues within inner city schools. And the origin of this letter that essentially burst open this entire scandal was something that was just completely ignored and in fact rubbished. But well, it doesn't really matter if it's a hoax or not. But what was very interesting about the podcast is the likes of Michael Gove and other government officials and the local council knew that the letter was fabricated. It's very important for your viewers to know this is a fabricated letter. This is undated, it's unsigned, it's incomplete, and it's not even the original letter that presented itself to the local authority or to...
But what would you say then to the response from the people that you've just named, who were saying that what the letter did do, even though it was false, was that it opened up opportunity to investigate what the situation like, and that found misconduct?
What right did they have to investigate HR issues that have there are policies and practices within schools to deal with minor issues that occur in those schools? If there are misdemeanors occurring between members of staff or between any individuals within the education sector, you have staffing policies that address these kind of things. Why was it that the government had to intervene and not intervene in other places, in other cases? What this was quite evidently was a tool used by the government to then thereafter blow up the measures of scrutinizing the Muslim community through their prevent agenda. That's what essentially Trojan Horse provided for them. And if it wasn't for Trojan Horse, it would have been something else. And that's the thing to remember. Trojan Horse was simply just a means for them to further scrutinize the Muslim community.
And then just tell us, do you ever want to go back into teaching? Because you were cleared, you were exonerated, you didn't lose your license, you can go back to a classroom, you can rediscover that mojo that you have. Have you just lost it?
It's very painful, even as you share this, to answer your question without actually being becoming upset by it. It was my passion. I hope maybe one day I can. I'd love to, but it's too painful right now to go back into the classroom because of what's happened. And what I would like to do now is to clear my name completely, not just as the courts did clear our names, but to actually clear our name publicly. That what happened at the hands of the government was, completely vindictive of what was a brilliant group of individuals that were teaching, raising standards, and improving the lives of those in the inner city. And now, if you look at the school, sadly, 8 years on, I looked at the Ofsted of the school that I taught, and it's currently inadequate. So 8 years on, they supposedly removed myself from the leadership of that school, completely tore apart the leadership and governorship of those schools, and yet they're inadequate. And the disparity between the results of the school and national average have grown even further. So the children are worse off. But where's the scandal now? Where's the care from the government now towards these schools? It's not there, because they don't really care. They don't really care about these children. What they wanted to do was utilize this event to then amp up their prevent motivations to essentially scrutinize us further and further marginalize us.
And then, so what's the future for you?
I don't know. I would love to write about this maybe one day, and share my journey as a Muslim man in this country, and how doing your very best isn't enough actually, and I'm unsure. That's the honest truth.
Well, you've been very honest and thoughtful with us tonight. We thank you, Razwan Faraz, for joining us and sharing your thoughts and your experience. What's your message about the podcast to our viewers? Just finally.
It's called the Trojan Horse Affair. Go onto Spotify or any podcast, you'll be able to catch it. Honestly, it is probably the best podcast you'll ever listen to. It's the most downloaded podcast in America right now. It will give you a huge insight into the workings of the story of Trojan Horse, and more importantly, it will present to you hope that we need to do something to ensure that it doesn't happen again.
Well, thank you so much. We've reached our end of our time together. Thank you for joining us, Razwan Faraz, and as I said, for the honesty you've shown tonight, and we wish you and your family well. When we come back after the break, we'll be heading to London and talk to Dr. Salman Butt about his journey, about clearing his name, and how you, if you're in the public eye like so many of us are, how you have to take hits again and again to defend the community, to take a stance against Islamophobia and racism and bigotry, and often at some personal risk to one's life and one's family. That's a struggle that we'll be talking to Dr. Salman Butt. So we'll take a quick break. Some important messages coming your way. Then don't go anywhere. Grab a coffee, and then we'll be back after this. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to Questions with me, Mohammed Shafiq, exclusively here on British Muslim TV. Shortly we'll be heading to London to talk to Dr. Salman Butt. Once he's with us, we'll do just that. But again, there's a sense of reflection as we see what is happening around the world, and the chaos and the inability to make sure that human rights and human dignity is something that we hold steadfast. And you heard it very strongly there from Razwan Faraz just before the break about the personal trauma that one has to go through and do so very publicly. And that is, if a sense of reflections for me as somebody who's in the public eye, for those of us who take a stance against Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred and racism, the risks that we sometimes have to take for our own selves and our families. And you at home and people in the country may not actually see that and see the challenges, the barriers, the discrimination, the harassment, and sometimes the threats and violence and death threats that one gets. And we don't do it for appreciation or even thanks, because we're doing, as I said, the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to defend the community, to do the best as we can, to strengthen our community, to take on the people who perpetuate Islamophobia, whether that be in our media, our politics, or in our everyday life. And these stories that we try to bring you here on this program is really an opportunity for us to come together, reflect, and to showcase some of those people who are on the front line fighting for you and me. And it just gives a chance to hear their stories, but also for us to show appreciation and thanks for all that they do. As I said, we're taking your calls now on 01924231083. You can get in touch with us on social media. British Muslim TV is the handle. Let's move on to our next and final story. Now, the prevent duty was introduced in the aftermath of 9/11 and the July the 7th terrorist attacks in London. Successive governments and all political parties have said it's their duty. First duty, solemn duty for any government, was to protect the nation from terrorism, safeguarding people from becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism, and is a key tool to protect citizens. Now, opponents of the prevent duty have claimed that the duty is discriminatory and adversely impacts British Muslims and contributes to increased Islamophobia. My next guest is Dr. Salman Butt. He's a writer and speaker and editor of the Islamic blog site Islam21c.com. In 2019, he took legal action against the government after they called him an extremist in 2015. He won his case, and in November 2021, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, apologised to Dr. Butt in a statement read out in open court. Dr. Salman Butt is based in London and is joining us live now on British Muslim TV from the city. Dr. Salman Butt, Assalamu alaikum. Warm welcome to the programme. Thank you so much and great to have this conversation.
Alaikum salam. Thanks for having me.
It's great. Now, we were reflecting on the impact of the war on terror with Moazzam Begg earlier. How do you assess the war on terror 20 years on?
Well, it's hard to really put a concise answer to that. I mean, it's changed probably everything about Muslims' life in public. You know, Muslims from the lens that Muslims are seen through, from the cradle to grave, as one phrase is common to describe counterterrorism and kind of industry. But it's had a huge impact. But the thing is, I think in the last 3 or 4 years or so, I feel that some of its tentacles are beginning to loosen, and we're seeing a resurgence of, younger, more confident Muslims. This is our kind of a remit, our focus at Islam 21C, which is to empower Muslims with confidence and impact. We're seeing younger Muslims who've been, born now in the war on terror age, who've kind of begun to resist in an organized way the racism, the Islamophobia, all the kinds of negative aspects of the war on terror discourse. And there's a huge amount of quality scholarship as well, from Muslims and non-Muslims mostly, about the harms of the war on terror as a discourse on a community, and just the poison that it's poured into the wells of social cohesion.
Do you accept that there was and there still is a threat from terrorism in this country and around the world, and the government, whichever political persuasion it is, has a duty to protect the nation from that evil and threat?
Well, this is the thing about the counterterrorism industry. It's inflated and it's inflated the public sense of insecurity and provoked kind of fear mongering and so forth. In terms of terrorism or any type of violence or any type of criminality, really, the prevailing view of like a peer-reviewed science and criminologists and academics on this subject is that a lot of these policies that are sold to us as making us safe from terrorism actually end up making it more likely that you're going to be a victim of some kind of social dysfunction. There's lots of good literature. If you look at, for example, Professor Arun Kudnani did a report a few years ago. I think it was exactly 10 years ago. So since back then they were saying, look, this whole focus on people's ideology and someone being a bit too radical in their political beliefs and so forth, this causes terrorism. That was rubbish even as far back as 2010 and 2012. The things that actually make it more likely that there's going to be social strife or kind of a discohesion in society, and obviously a very small minority of people acting in a violent way. Those things are things like alienation, a sense of being repressed, a sense that you're not able to air your grievances or your views publicly without perceived state suppression. These are the things that actually policies like PREVENT actually fester. And these are the things that are actually empirically determined causes for things like political violence and terrorism. That's why many academics, and including the People's Review of PREVENT, which was kind of published a few weeks ago, they say it clearly that PREVENT and so-called counter-extremism measures that are sold to the public off the back of scaring people that there's going to be some kind of, there's some kind of terrorist hiding on your bed or something. These policies actually make us less safe. They actually increase the prevalence of the empirically determined causes. So
you're not recognizing the threat from terrorism at all?
Well, there's a threat from terrorism, much like there's a threat from anything. The famous statistic that you're more likely to be killed by a bee sting than a terrorist. So however small that threat is, it's there. But my point is, just because policymakers, they use this threat to scare you and me in order to giving them more and more of our hard-earned civil liberties, it doesn't mean that actually doing so makes us more safe from that threat. It actually, what people researching this area, they keep telling us, and have been since 2010, is that doing so actually makes us less safe. So if someone says that, okay, the threat of terrorism is important enough for us to put resources and so forth into, the way we're going about legislating these policies is actually making us less safe from the threat of terrorism, i.e. it's increasing the threat of terrorism, however small it is anyway. But policies like PREVENT, so-called anti-extremism policies that, target so-called non-violent extremism, instead of actually targeting the empirically determined causes of terrorism, that makes us less safe.
Okay. And when did you find out about being labelled as an extremist by the government?
So that was in, I think, 2015. I woke up one day and just saw, my name mentioned in a government press release. It's 17th September 2015. So before then, it was, we didn't know anything about even many other people, being defamed like this. So I went to speak to my local MP, Fiona McTaggart, and she said, she would ask the Home Office and question in Parliament, and they asked, and it then transpired that the government was, or there's a branch in the Home Office that was uncritically accepting effectively surveillance intelligence about private citizens from shady third-party organizations, some organizations that are very proudly even Islamophobic. So this is what allowed us to take on a few legal challenges, which we got. We won one of them, and the other one is still carrying on. It's a judicial review into PREVENT, arguing that PREVENT itself is illegal. Yeah,
because it can be quite devastating and dangerous for you and your family for these allegations to be made in that very official way. How did you cope with that, and how did your family cope?
Yeah, it was quite shocking, but I think everyone who knows me, they realize that this is that kind of the final nail in this whole extremism discourse, because it's the thing about extremism is, right, as a phrase, as a discourse, if you call someone a murderer, you know what that means. The person who makes the claim knows what it means, and the person who's being accused of it knows what it means. A court can kind of make a determination on that. Did you defame him or her or not? If you call someone a thief, they know what it means. If you call someone an extremist, it doesn't really have a clear definition. It's very vacuous. It's vague enough for anyone to use against someone they don't like, and it's serious enough that lots of policies unfortunately have been built on top of that. And I, in my opinion, that's one of the reasons why the government had to yield in this case and apologize, because it just doesn't have a proper operational definition. Right, the government's defense in the defamation case was ranging all over the place, from honest opinion to say basically, extremism doesn't mean anything. It's just someone's subjective opinion. It's not based on any objective criteria. This was part of the arguments, all the way to. So what if someone calls you an extremist? The government's itself, one of the arguments was, it doesn't matter if someone calls you extremist, it doesn't mean anything pretty much. And this is quite shocking, because on the one hand, they're saying it doesn't really mean anything, it's a subjective value judgment, which it is. But on the other hand, they're building lots of policies on top of that. So if somebody is smeared with this label, they could take your passport away, they could make you subject to a TPIM, like an order that restricts your movement, for example. They can get your speeches banned and your books burned and all this kind of stuff. Off this, this, what I argue is the modern kind of equivalent to a heretic.
Okay, so just stay there, Dr. Salman Butt. I know you're going to stay with us. We're going to take our final break. When we come back, we'll continue this very important conversation and your own personal story. As I said, this is our last break. Dr. Salman Butt is our guest. 01924231003. We'll open the calls shortly. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to Questions with me, Mohammed Shafiq. Just a break, we were talking to Dr. Salman Butt, and we're going to continue that conversation. As I promised, we're going to open the line, so if you've got any questions for him, please pick up the phone 01924 230. Put my teeth back in, 01924 231 083, and get in touch with us on social media as well. Dr. Salman Butt, we were just talking before, we were talking during the break about this wasn't just about you. You were fighting for British Muslims. What has the response been from the British Muslim community?
I mean, it's been overwhelming. I mean, lots of people have been, affected and impacted by policies like Prevent, by this whole language of extremism. And people are very happy that someone's, and many people, it's not just myself, but whenever someone, kind of challenges and stands up for these basic kind of rights of ours, and many people feel very kind of, just relieved that, thank God, some people are fighting this area, because if we don't, it's just kicking the can down for later generations to pick up the piece, and it could get worse, And it's not just British Muslims, whenever, ever since I can remember, when I heard this phrase of extremism, and especially this weird non-violent extremism, phrase that Prevent was built on, many people, not just myself, we said, this is only a matter of time before it gets broadened to include more and more people. And since then, I've seen it applied to animal rights activists, anti-fracking demonstrators, eco demonstrators, Extinction Rebellion, famously, lots of people using this language and terminology of extremism. So if we don't challenge these incursions on our hard-fought rights to get across and hold our own beliefs, then it's going to be it's just a matter of time before more and more people get impacted by this. And it's very important that we stand firm and we've got nothing to hide.
Yeah, and then when the government had decided to read that statement from the Home Secretary with an apology that was read out in open court, that was a huge moment for you, but also the British Muslim community. Did you at that moment understand the historic impact that you just made?
Well, it was like after 6 years on. So it was, we had been notified a year beforehand, but because of the pandemic, it was lots of things were delayed. So it wasn't like a surprise. But when I did actually get the news that they want to apologize and pay damages and legal costs and all that kind of stuff, I was so relieved, alhamdulillah, and I didn't really recognize or think of the immediately the kind of ramifications, but I hoped that this would be, there's ramifications that are from a legal perspective and a political perspective, but there's also ramifications in terms of giving people that boost in morale, that they shouldn't just kind of lie down and have their rights curtailed and just kind of volunteer acquiescence almost. It's a really important principle, actually, not to just volunteer compliance. When powerful bodies and people of power are increasing their arbitrary powers more and more, it's important for us to collectively, as the public, as citizens, push back these attempts to kind of regulate lawful speech, which is what this whole notion of extremism is, and it's really important that Muslims feel that moral kind of victory as well, and that boost in their morale.
Now, before the break, we were talking to Razwan Faraz and Moazzam Begg. The New York Times podcast on the Birmingham Trojan Horse scandal is getting lots of coverage, not just here in the UK, well, was getting lots of coverage up until what happened between Ukraine and Russia. Have you listened to the podcast? What's your reaction?
Yeah, I listened to it. It's gripping. We had Tahir Alam and Professor John Homewood who are central to this narrative. We had them on the Islam 20 podcast, which is going to be released soon, inshallah. This is a huge cataclysm for the British Muslim community, and in fact everywhere. I mean, Brian Reed in the podcast was saying that when it came on his radar, it was someone in Alaska or something, where there's like no Muslim. There was one Muslim in an entire, town, and they were talking about it there, in terms of no-go areas in Birmingham. So this whole Trojan hoax fiasco was a cataclysm, in British Muslim history, and it had ramifications all over the world, to fueling Islamophobic headlines, to fueling Islamophobic attacks all over the world as a result of these, millennium-old stereotypes of the invading, infidel Muslim coming here and taking over your land and so forth. So it's really, really important that, and it's very sad actually that it took 4 years of investigative journalism from someone in a different country. And I said, when I was listening to it, I was taking some notes as well, that this is an indictment on British journalism, sadly. That the entirety, I think it was one phrase, somebody being interviewed, they said, well, nobody's ever asked me that actually. And they were like, why has no one asked you these very basic questions from the UK kind of press? And they said, I don't know, you should go and ask them that. And we should. And now is the time for accountability. There are so many, unfortunately, times where instead of the press carrying out their duty of holding power to account and making sure that we're in a democracy, we're informed enough to make good decisions about our political future and ambitions and so forth. They betrayed this trust, unfortunately, and they just sided with racist, Islamophobic headlines to serve powerful interests, which is a shame.
Now, those newspapers still go after you from time to time. How do you deal with that, and how do you react to that?
When in all this, this kind of hostility towards Muslim, public Muslims and kind of symbols of Islam in public, it takes the path of least resistance. Yeah. So if you actually stand up and fight back, obviously in a legal way, they just move on to the next kind of victim. But if you just kind of have the passive type of sabr and just be patient and not shout for your rights and call out and complain when your rights are being transgressed, or somebody's doing something silly, then it's just going to keep happening. And this is one of the issues of volunteering compliance and acquiescence. If somebody is from all the way from an Islamophobic journalist to an Islamophobic policy, somebody enacting an Islamophobic policy, like local prevent coordinators or whatever, if you just tell them thanks but no thanks, you can move on. You're not welcome in this to snoop around in this establishment or in our organization. They'll just move on to someone else. But if you kind of invite them in and try to show, oh look, I'm not an extremist, I'm a really nice person just like you, then they're just gonna kind of come back more again and again, and you're going to be stuck into a loop of in that kind of relationship where you're going to be influenced, you're going to be spied on, and you're going to face more and more, ironically, more and more problems because you didn't resist. So there's no kind of there shouldn't be any acquiescing to something which is fundamentally racist and Islamophobic, right? So when it comes to the press complaint, we have. It's good from one angle that Muslims, they have that resilience that, if somebody attacks you, you just kind of brush it off, which is good and a good state of mind to be in. But we still have to make a spectacle out of when somebody does do something which is grossly, misleading, for example, in the press, or attacking someone from unjust grounds and so forth. Because number one, nobody's going to come and fight for your rights. You have to fight for your own rights. Number two, we need statistics as well. Different organizations that are working on logging.
Salman, I'm just going to say we've probably got about 3 minutes left, and I just wanted to ask you two very brief questions. one of them is around the fact that you're a regular speaker on university campuses. I know we've had a pandemic and lots of virtual meetings. Have you started to notice a change in the amount of bookings you're getting, the speeches that you're doing since your case in November last year?
Well, I noticed that in around 2015, 2016, kind of the Islamic society scene just really went dead, pretty much across the board, unfortunately. And this was because many Muslim students were saying, we have to go through extra hoops. It was Muslim and Palestinian societies, unfortunately. They had to go through more hoops when, and more forms compared to any other society when booking speakers and so forth. And they have that self-policing. This is why Prevent has a chilling effect on campus, right? People start to self-police and so forth. So there was a dip in the activism and the da'wah basically on campuses. But we're noticing a rise again, alhamdulillah, that, more, like I said, the generation of Muslims now that are in university, they are more radical in a good way. They're more brave. They're not. They won't easily be pushed around. By Islamophobic think tanks and journalists or people just good old fashioned racists. So we're seeing an increase now in the bravery of Islamic societies and Muslim activists on campus.
And then my final question is, what's the future for you?
Well, we have another, I mentioned just briefly, we have another legal case pending before the European Court of Human Rights now, and that is a judicial review into Prevent. Yeah, so we went through to the High Court and the Court of Appeals here, and we got some positive outcomes. So, for the first time, a judge actually outlined the limits of Prevent. So the government's argued itself that it's not a duty. No one has to actually implement it. They just have to have due regard, something called due regard to stopping people being drawn into terrorism. And secondly, this whole extremism nonsense is out the window. So people don't have to follow any kind of definition of extremism from the government.
Sorry, Dr. Salman, we've reached the end of our time together. We've probably got about 30 seconds, but just want to say thank you, sir. We'll keep an eye on that case and stay in touch, and inshallah get you back on to talk about that. That was Dr. Salman Butt joining us live from London. We've reached the end of the programme. Thank you to Moazzam Begg, Razwan Faraz and Salman Butt, Dr. Salman Butt. We're back next week at the same time of 8:30. From everybody here at British Muslim TV, thank you for joining us. Take care of yourself and each other. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.